To most of you listening to this podcast, my guest, Amit Varma, needs no introduction. He's a prolific writer, journalist, ex poker player, and podcaster. His incredible body of work includes the newsletter, India Uncut, the award winning podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, and his latest labor of love with Ajay Shah, Everything is Everything. Today, we sit down to explore one of his core beliefs that freedom and liberty matter, that the relationship between state and society must be anchored in the classical liberal contention of rights. A quick note if this is your first time listening. On this podcast, I take a contrarian stance. Not because I really disagree with my guest, but because I believe that it is the best way to test their ideas. My role isn't to win an argument, it is to push back, question, and explore. I hope you enjoy listening. Hi, Amit. Welcome to the podcast.
Deepak, thank you so much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here. So, I must tell Deepak's listeners an interesting factoid that we've been meeting up over the years at conferences. Deepak's
Yep.
been a guest on The Seen and the Unseen. But that was after I've chatted with him for a long, long period of time and found him incredibly interesting and someone I could learn from. But one common theme in the last couple of conferences where we've been together is what do we disagree about? Because it just became this constant meme that we seem to agree on everything. I will
Correct.
say the
Yes.
most outrageous thing, like it is immoral to have children and Deepak will agree with me, or he'll say what he thinks is outrageous, and I'll agree with him. And we were like, "This is too much. Do we have to get married now?" And then he started the show. Deepak disagrees,
Which is better
partly,
than marrying you, so.
which is much better than marrying me, both for both of us. And my nagging kind of caused you to sort of start this also. So I'll take a little bit of credit, may I? For and so today we get to disagree. So yeah,
Yeah, and the very first pilot episode, long before the actual first episode, was also aired when you came to Bangalore. So, yeah.
there you go.
Okay, so the way to kick this off, I think, is to get you to first lay the foundations here. Because unlike most of the guests who come on who have very specific topic to talk about, this is very large, nebulous, and has a couple hundred years of thinking behind the subject. So, if you can lay out just the broad framework of what your proposition is, and then I'll start first principles and try and go through them line by line and see why they could potentially be wrong or if there's a meaningful counter to any of those ways of looking at the world.
Sounds good. Let me narrow it down, or rather, let me define it very specifically and say that the fundamental question I want to address is this: what should be the relationship between the state and society? Right? We often take the state for granted as a leviathan or as this, benign beast that will look over us, or even this body that will rule us. But none of that actually makes sense. How do I think about the state? How do I think about the society? What the relationship between them should be? And I begin with individual rights. That's at the heart of the way that I think about the world. I have in the past, spoken about the word freedom. I have used the word consent to sort of define this. But for the purpose of today's discussion, let's talk about rights and let me kind of give you a sense of where I come from and how I arrived at that position. I'll begin with John Locke. John Locke came up with what he called the right to self ownership. And in his mind, the right to self ownership was the most fundamental right. That is where rights begin. Because after all, when a child is born, who owns the child? The question itself seems bizarre. God does not own the child. People will anyway argue about which God. The state does not own the child. The parents don't own the child. It's going to grow up and go away. Who owns the child? And the obvious answer is that the child owns itself. And from that right to self ownership emanate all other rights, right? And I'll draw a distinction between negative and positive rights after this. But let's first talk about where Locke goes with this. Locke's saying that, hey, you own yourself. Once we accept that, and that is your first principle, everything that emanates from that becomes a right. So if you own yourself, the right to life emerges because no one can kill you because they'll be infringing on your right to self ownership. Equally, the right to free speech emerges. If you own yourself, you own your thoughts, you have the right to voice them, right? The right to property emerges, that you mix your labor with something not already owned by anyone, or you exchange a part of your property for someone else's property.
Mm.
The right to property emerges from there, and so on and so forth. And Locke's reasoning was that this conception respects human dignity and human autonomy and human agency, and therefore this is a way that we should live. Now, there is one argument I want to bypass completely. That's an argument about natural rights versus rights that are granted to you by the state or agreed upon by society, if such a thing is possible at all. And I want to say that there are people like Bentham, I think, famously said natural rights are nonsense upon stilts. I don't exactly want to go there because I'm making a slightly deeper argument. I'm saying that even if you are to argue that there are no natural rights per se, I would still make the argument that if we are to agree upon a system of rights that works well for everyone, then this is that. This framework is that where you begin with the right to self ownership and you end up with all of these other rights, right? And at this point, I will distinguish because people use the term rights in such woolly ways. I will distinguish between what are known as negative rights and positive rights.
Right.
Isaiah Berlin, the great philosopher, came up with this conception of negative freedom and positive freedom. And there are a class of entitlements or entitlements, quote unquote, which are often touted as rights. For example, people will say everyone should get free food, everyone should get housing, everybody should get broadband, whatever, whatever. And these rights don't emanate from the right to self ownership. Somebody is giving you something you don't already have. And to give this to you, they need to infringe the rights of others, right? So these are known as positive rights, while everything that emanates from the right to self ownership, they're called negative rights. Why are they called negative rights? Because they imply that someone should not do something to you. My right to life means you cannot kill me. My right to property means you cannot steal from me. My right to free speech means that you cannot shut me up. So negative rights, you can't, infringe on that, and then that's how one would
These are
define
things you
freedom.
already have. And in
Right.
this case, the state's job is to prevent me from infringing upon rights that you already
Correct, and
have.
we'll come to the state job later. But
Sure.
positive rights are when you are saying that I want someone to give this to me, the right to food, the right to employment, the right to whatever, right? And the only way somebody can give you those rights is by committing violence on somebody else, because all of these things are scarce. Now, I don't mean to imply that people should not eat or that, food is a bad thing, employment is a bad thing, etc., etc. Not at all. I'm just saying that from a terminological point of view, to be clear about what we are talking about, it doesn't make sense to describe those things as rights. So when I think of rights, just to clarify the way that I think of them, I'm thinking of negative rights. You cannot do a certain thing to me. Now, leave aside the question of natural rights. Let us say that you agree with me that it would be one that this framework works for us, and I will explain why
Hmm.
it works for us later. But assume that you agree that it works for us. Who enforces this, right? Uh, Man in a state of nature will experience a life that, in Hobbes's words, is nasty, short, and brutish,
Yep.
right? So, what I call the great liberal paradox comes into play. We need the state to protect us. And this means for our rights to be protected, we need to give up some of them. Because the existence of the state means that we grant the state a monopoly on violence, and it has to take taxes to exist. Taxes are coercion, and therefore, taxation is theft, as libertarians famously like to say. And therefore, you are giving away little chunk of your rights, and you're saying that fine, for the rest of my rights to exist, I will make this compromise, and the state comes into play. Right? This is what I call the great liberal paradox. So now the thing to remember here is that we cannot take the state therefore for granted. It exists for a reason, but it exists at a moral cost, right? So, I once wrote a Times of India article with the headline, Every act of government is an act of violence. We forget this. Whatever the state does, it is inflicting violence upon us. Its existence
Hmm.
is an act of violence, and anything that it does requires further taxes and often requires outright coercion, and therefore it is violence. It is not my case to say the state should not exist. It is a great liberal paradox that for our rights to have meaning, we need someone to protect it, therefore the state. But it is very much my case that when we propose state action for anything, then we have to take that violence into account, and we have to make an argument for why that violence is justified. To me, this is all of politics. If you think about it, at the heart of it, all of politics is about what the state should do and how you justify it, right? There will be the position I am closest to is a classical liberal position where I would say that, look, the state came into existence to protect our rights, and that is all it should do by and large, and therefore they should be a night watchman state. I also have sympathy for the argument that the state should do infrastructure, that building roads, building ports,
Hmm.
it is good for the people, right? You can also then say that, hey, there are great positive externalities in building a space program and we should do that. You could also say that no, we need to build national pride and therefore we have to have statues of our great leaders, right? To me, I am not in this episode going to argue for a particular position out of these. I am not going to say that we should only have a state that does rule of law and defense and blah, 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 and not build statues. To me, that is a stuff of political discourse, right? All I ask to everyone listening to this is every time you demand state action for something, consider that there is a moral cost to it and an opportunity cost to it. The moral cost is that what you want the state to do can only happen through the violence that the action will involve, both by itself and by the fact that the state exists. And the opportunity cost is a state will always have a limited amount of money. And with the money you want spent on your preference, something else that someone else wants, which could be good for society, isn't getting done. So both of these are critically important. We often, like in India, I say we have the religion of the state. We assume that there is a Mai Baap Sarkar, and it has unlimited resources which do not have a cost. And whatever we want, we can get it to do. It will. We can shape society accordingly. And that's a tremendous fallacy. Every act of government is an act of violence, as Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar write in their book In Service of the Republic. The cost of every 1 rupee of taxes is 3 rupees of GDP. That's the opportunity cost that is happening.
Hmm.
So we need to consider that deeply. So I think that therefore, the great liberal paradox implies that we need a state, we give it the monopoly on violence, we accept the coercion that kind of comes with it, but you therefore want to have safeguards and limit state power. And remember that the state exists to protect us and to serve us and not to rule us. And the default thinking, especially in India, where we've adopted the colonial mindset, is that we are subjects and not citizens, and the state is there to rule us and not serve us. So, a lot of nuances I can go into, and I know you'll want to double click on a lot of things,
Yeah,
but this is overall the bedrock of my thinking on this subject.
awesome. I think that's really helpful. Um, I want to go right to the beginning of where you started, right? You started off actually by saying when parents have children, the question emerges who owns the child, and it seems an obvious answer that the child owns itself. That's one of the premises based on which this entire edifice is built. Why does the parent not own the child?
It's a good philosophical question which Locke has spoken about. Murray Rothbard has argued this point exactly. I'll kind of defer to them, but the reason the parent doesn't own the child and is merely responsible for the child, in my view, is that I find something horrifying about the thought of one human being owning another human being.
Hmm.
I accept that the parent is the steward of the child and is responsible for the child. They've brought like, one, they are responsible because they brought the child into the world, and two, they can control what the kid does or doesn't do because, hey, the kid is too young to kind of decide those things for themselves. So I buy the stewardship of the parent over the child. But the thought that one human being can own another human being is utterly horrifying. And at this point, if I may, there is one part of my sort of bedrock thinking that I
Hmm.
forgot to get into, which I quickly want to sum up, which is this: that I have laid out the moral reason for keeping rights at the center of my thinking, the deontological reason, as it were, that I take the right to self ownership as my fundamental first principle. But even from a consequentialist point of view, freedom provides the best outcomes. If you look at the progress of humanity. We are recording this at a conference. Yesterday, somebody asked me what happened in the last 200 years that we progressed so much.
Hmm.
And the answer to that is freedom. The answer to that is that, voluntary exchange between consenting adults led to the Industrial Revolution, boosted by the fact that it could happen at scale because of the railways and the technology for travel got much better. And every voluntary interaction between two people leaves both people better off. It is therefore axiomatic that the more such interactions they are, the more the value in the world grows. It is a positive sum game, not a zero sum game. And that is a secret of human progress. This is something that we absolutely know, that economic growth is a success of all human welfare. Um, there's a great paper by the economist Land Pritchett, and I have an episode with him on this as well,
Hmm.
where he argues that economic growth is both necessary and sufficient for human welfare. And he looked at a whole bunch of countries over a few decades and mapped all the indicators of human welfare like good health and etc., and found that all of them without exception had more than 99% correlation with high per capita GDP, which basically means economic growth, and almost no correlation or less than 1% correlation with welfare, statism or redistribution and all of that. So, on the one hand, in terms of consequences, I would like to argue that freedom, economic freedom, following this framework of rights, gives absolutely the best outcomes for everyone, for the rich, for the poor, for everyone. Like since the 91 liberalization, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty in India. I would also argue that personal freedom leads to, to cultural growth and to artistic growth and to satisfaction and happiness. But I can't quantify that with numbers, but I think it is intuitive enough, and I don't think that is one of the areas where you'll disagree with
No,
me.
not at all.
Mm,
So I want to just go back to that question because everything else you said after that is like a part two of what I was leading to. But
mm.
you've made an a priori statement, one that requires no justification in your mind, which is that I own myself. A person owns themselves, right? I mean, and there are two loopholes here, I feel. The first loophole here is when a child is created, it is created off the parent. If the parent owns their body, I'm not able to see a reasonable way to argue that the child owns itself. Or I can see just as easy an a priori position that somebody may hold that I have created this child who would not exist without my willful action, who has come off me, of the food I have eaten, of the labor I have put into producing that food, of the act of intercourse that I have engaged in with a consensual other partner. Uh, I have created this thing that did not exist prior. It is of my labor and of my ownership. Uh, Now, you could just say a priori, I think that version 2 of the world is better than version 1 of the world. But other than that, is there any other way to argue that a child does not own itself and is not better off just being owned by its parents?
I mean, that would imply that everyone is a slave to their parents as long as the parents are alive. And that sounds
And
one.
could be passed on as property, could be contracted away to another individual, all of the things that come with contracts.
Yeah, yeah, that just seems fundamentally against the notion of human dignity. But what I would say is that when you say that a priori, I have, begun with the assumption that the right to self, that we own ourselves.
Hmm.
I would just say that that is why I actually felt it important to make that second clarification. That even if you reject that a priori assumption, the point I'm making is that in terms of consequences,
I hear you. And that I want to push back against as a second point.
yeah.
But just on that first bit,
Hmm.
forget the consequences because I feel, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you would say, irrespective of the consequences, even if it was a second best option on the table, the deontological way of looking at this is the right way. First principles, we own ourselves. Now, it may so be in some circumstances that the consequences are better off if there's central control, somebody else looks right. But by and large, this is the better way, simply because that is the moral position that you're taking. So this has to be a priori, right? This is a leap that you are making that you just think that we all have to agree on because it is good for some reason, like better than the alternative of being owned by parents.
So, if I am to make a deontological argument for a first principle, I would actually make it for a related first principle that leads me to this. The reason I begin with the right to self ownership and all that is it's a framework that fits my deontological
Correct.
beliefs and it also works in the real world. But the deontological belief I'd like to argue with is Kant's categorical imperative,
Hmm.
where Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, I think the second formulation of it is that you should never treat another person as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. And this arises from the first formulation, which I think essentially, if I remember correctly, I mean, I'll paraphrase, essentially argues that you want to treat others the way you want them to treat you. Lots to argue against between the gaps, but I find Kant's argument really convincing. I cannot find meaning in my life unless I accept that I am an autonomous human being and that I am in control of my actions and I am responsible for them. And uh, I think that is a decent a priori position to argue with, and it feeds into though even though they're not directly related, but it is synchronous with what Locke says about the right to self ownership. And by the way, another clarification for listeners:
Hmm.
the implication of all of these rights is our rights exist up to the point that we don't infringe anyone else's rights.
Of
So our
course.
rights only have meaning if we don't infringe anyone else's rights. My hand to move my fist, my right to move my fist, ends where your face begins.
Right.
Right.
This
So,
feels coercive to me, though. When you
hmm,
say that um, my life feels meaningless without these rights and
hmm,
them being protected,
hmm,
you speak for yourself, and that's fine.
hmm.
But you also speak for every unborn child, every child that will be born into this liberal democracy that you construct with this edifice, all of whom have not consented to this. and are being coerced into a system where these a priori this a priori leap has been made on their behalf.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I have made an argument in a controversial column, which you, to my surprise, you said you agreed with entirely, that it is immoral to have children. And the
Hmm.
reasoning I laid out is that number one, it is wrong to do something to anyone without their consent. Number two, it is wrong to cause pain.
Yes.
Number three, it is wrong to kill someone. And when you have kids, you are bringing them into the world without their consent, like duh, because obviously they're not capable of it, and they're going to feel pain and they're going to die. So therefore, it is, and it's not a utilitarian argument. It's just this argument from
From
there.
consent, yeah.
Yeah. So what you just sort of stated is exactly that, and I agree with that. But I'm just saying that once a human being is on this planet, you know, you have to respect the autonomy and agency of that person, and uh, y- you can do it through a deontological frame where you say this person is an end in themselves. They are not a means to an end. I'm a parent. I have given birth to a child for my own amusement. The child will earn for me. I will contract it away.
Hmm.
All of this would go against Kant's categorical imperative. And secondly, I am saying that if you look at human society, freedom is what works. Like the biologist E.O. Wilson, who studied ants carefully, once said about communism, great idea, wrong species. His sense was that communism would work great with ants, but it went fundamentally against human nature, where the desire for autonomy and agency is hardwired into us and
Hmm.
we value it so much. And therefore, I am saying that I am making the case that this is the only conception, the only framework through which we look at the relationship between the state and the society that truly works. So, rather, it's the most optimal framework
I hear you.
which works for everyone.
I want to ask specifically about the consequentialist side, but like a final question on this train of thought.
Hmm.
If the state were to so pass a law, decree, that the creation of new children is not allowed,
Hmm.
you are not allowed to create new children because it fundamentally infringes on their right to even want life. They are not consenting to creating life. Through this framework, you'd say, yeah, that makes sense.
No, I wouldn't, because the state does not own the body of the two adults who are, making a child together.
Hmm.
It does not own their body, and it cannot aim to speak on behalf of someone who doesn't exist yet. So it doesn't make sense for that reason.
So, I mean, it sounds like you're saying it's a violation of rights that can't be protected because the person whose rights are being violated does not exist yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm pro choice.
Hmm.
For example, to me, a woman owns her body, period. Right? It is this unfortunate paradox, which is for individuals to resolve. That sometimes you have another life inside you, and then it comes to how do you define life, when does life begin, etc., etc. I don't want to get into all that. I have great sympathy for both positions, by the way.
Hmm.
I have great sympathy for the position about the sacredness of life and all of that. But ultimately, I am a dogmatist that we own our bodies, and the woman owns her body, and the state simply cannot tell her what to do. You can sort of have an opinion that she is doing something immoral if she chooses to have an abortion. That is your right to have an opinion, but she owns her body. You simply cannot interfere with that.
Got it. Understood. Okay. Now, on the consequentialist bit, I have two questions here. Well, actually, the easy one first. I'm presupposing you believe in Darwinism. We all come from animals. We're all monkeys in shoes. Um, Evolution by natural selection is something that you've bought into simply because the evidence points towards it.
In fact, it shaped my whole thinking about the world. So it's
Right.
illuminated the way I think about the world. Yeah.
There seems to be no evidence that Darwinism selects for good rational thinking. The things that we've selected for always do not point towards being the most rational person in the room. Um, the way that you've constructed this edifice of a state is using reason. You're saying first I'm making an a priori leap. Using this leap, I'm connecting A to B and B to C, and then we're creating all the pillars of a democracy, and each of them have their functions. We've gotten this far, and 8 billion people do this now, or many do in liberal democracies. Um, but why trust in reason? Why is rationality the way to go about this?
What other way is there? I mean, then you reach a situation of life being nasty, brutish, and short, right? Like I am just like in a sense, before I'm being normative, I'm being positive.
Hmm.
I'm saying that this is the way the world works, that society is better off and people flourish when there is freedom, which includes freedom to do what you freedom in the marketplace and freedom in the bedroom, and you need both sorts. And it's bizarre to me that different ideologies will treat one of
Mm-hmm.
those as kosher and the other one as not kosher. um, and so I'm making that positive statement, and therefore there I'm saying that, hey, let's live that way. But ultimately, I think that how we choose to live is an act of negotiation, and it is up to me to try and use my reason and rationality to convince other people that this works. And I'm glad you brought up natural selection because, natural selection has hardwired us in different ways. Many of our impulses run contrary to each other. And some of our intuitions are wrong simply because of the time we evolved in. Like, I have an episode of Everything is Everything called Five Economic Fallacies or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But my central point there is not just to point out the particular fallacies, but to say that they're hardwired into us. For example, there is a zero sum fallacy. We evolved in prehistoric times where you lived in a small tribe where there was scarcity of everything. If you have the leg of a deer, I can't have that leg. There's only one leg,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you think in a zero sum way, for me to win, someone else has to lose. For my tribe to do well, I have to take that land and
Correct.
that hunting ground from the other tribe. And actually, the world works beautifully, especially at scale, in a positive sum way. And another fallacy is a top-down fallacy that we evolve in prehistoric times where there's a tribe of 150 people is best controlled by a strong man, which explains the instinctive appeal of strong man, and therefore who will do things from the top down and give orders. And in 150 people, that's totally manageable. Over a society, top down does not work. Everything is bottom up, and I can talk for many hours in this, but all of the world, like natural selection, language, economies, prices, society, culture, everything is spontaneous order, everything is bottom up, right? So, but again, our intuitions are that it is top down. So, therefore, the job of the rationalist is to constantly, A, keep eternal vigilance, as Jefferson allegedly said, and B, to constantly drive these points home because our instinct will take us in to think in zero sum ways and therefore, to assume a view of the world which is actually false
Mm.
and to think in top down ways where the engineering mindset comes into play and the state repeatedly makes a mistake of trying to refashion society according to its will, depending on what the fashion of the day is. And that also never works. So it is the job of, like, for me, the great Enlightenment project, and in a sense, the great human project, is a project to fight our hardwiring. We are the only species that can be aware of its hardwiring and fight it.
Mm.
In some cases, we need to mitigate our worst instincts, like our instinct towards tribalism and violence and maybe promiscuity in men and etc etc. And at another level, it is to amplify the better angels of our nature, as Steven Pinker would say. And so I think rationality is super important. And I think when you say that, hey, why should we do it if natural selection hasn't hardwired for it, that commits what is called the naturalistic fallacy. What is natural is good. And also, which I think G.E. Moore came up with. And David Hume came up with the is ought fallacy, that you assume that because something is a particular way in nature, it ought to be that way. I'm saying both of those are not true. We happen to be, by the accident of natural selection, we just happen to be that one rational species which can fight its own hardwiring. And I'm making the plea, let us do that. But there is no God, and therefore I can't say this is good, that is bad. Those terms are very woolly, but I can make my case, which is what I'm doing.
Got it. Understood. Okay. And the second bit on the consequentialist question was, to what end? Through the conversation so far, you've said things like progress is good, or that we do not have meaning sans rights. Um, we will likely live, when we were speaking about this before we started, I was asking, why not default to anarchy? And one of the reasons why we shouldn't is likely because we will live in a violent state where a lot of these quote unquote rights are constantly infringed upon by our fellow man and woman. And I know you not to be a utilitarian. That doesn't seem to be the thing that you default to. So, consequence to what end? We're doing all of this to solve towards something. The arrow points somewhere. Where is this place?
So I do not have the hubris that I want to determine, the end to which society should aspire. I don't like that collective term. I think individuals should be free to go towards whatever ends they wish to do, and therefore freedom as a default is a good way to think about it. My So I'll say two things. One, my problem with consequentialism slash utilitarianism is a knowledge problem. The world is too deeply complex for
Yeah.
us to understand the consequences of our actions. And very often, people who will cite a utilitarian argument for doing something they want to do are rationalizing and making assumptions that they shouldn't make.
Post facto.
It's post facto. So that is my problem. Or even pre facto, they are saying that if I do this, this will happen.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas often the opposite happens. If I have a labor law, labor will be protected. Whereas we know in the real world, if you use economic principles, often it's the workers who are hurt by that. So Part one is that while I think there are these fundamental problems with consequentialism and utilitarianism, at the same time, while I think it is almost absurd to think about an act in consequential terms, there's a term called rule utilitarianism. That if you apply this rule, are the consequences better off? And I think when it comes to, for example, free markets,
Hmm.
I think the jury is no longer out on that. It is absolutely clear with the massive sample size that yes, free markets are good for human welfare. Which brings me to the second point, that as someone who thinks about economics and about policy, I am adopting Gandhiji's metric. And Gandhiji's metric for thinking about policy or state action was, what will it mean for the poorest person in the nation? That is the only freaking thing I care about, especially.
Why? And the reason, the
Hmm,
way to ask this question also is, if you lived in an anarchist state,
hmm,
um, ruled by brute force and might,
hmm,
then there will be some small collection of people who are mighty, by
hmm.
the violent definition of mighty, and will control the most land and be well off, and from a utilitarian standpoint, have a great life. While there will be 95% of people who live under the dominion, hate their lives or struggle through it, it is suffering. And you're making a value judgment here. You're saying that there are moral poles. One of these is better, and one of these is worse. So there is an end. The end is, like you're saying, something like the most amount of welfare for most people, which is just
No,
utility.
that's not what I'm saying, because the most amount of welfare for most people could mean that Adani owns all the money in the country and it is so much that if you average it out, the per capita is high. That's terrible. What I am saying in practical terms is that, if you're thinking about public policy, especially in a liberal democracy, it almost then becomes a responsibility. And this is a whole other argument on what should a nation state do or whatever. But it becomes a responsibility, especially of a poor country like India, that let's do well for the poor. Now, my argument is that the optimal solution, if it is best for the poor, is also best for the rich. It's best for everyone because you're amplifying the positive sumness. You're amplifying the number of voluntary interactions in society. We are not in a zero sum world. Like, one distinction I keep pointing out to people is a distinction between inequality and poverty. Right? People think they're the same thing. They will mean poverty, but they will use the term inequality. And I'm
Mm.
like, no, think about this, right? If the world was zero sum, poverty and inequality would mean the same thing. If the rich got richer, the poor would get poorer. Like, duh, obviously. But the world is positive sum. Everybody can get richer at the same time. And because the rich have more to start with, they will get richer faster than the poor get richer, but they'll all get richer. Now, if you look at what happened in India after 1991, is that we lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty while inequality went up, right? But people came out of poverty.
Yeah.
Similarly, a question I often ask people is, where would you rather be poor, in the USA or in Bangladesh? And most people would rather be poor in the USA. But inequality is higher in the USA, poverty is higher in Bangladesh, though they're doing well recently,
Mm.
because they have more sensible laws than India. So we need to make the distinction between inequality and poverty. And what I am saying is that I feel that as an Indian, and this is a personal position that I don't want to, that I'm not sure I can rationally justify,
Of course.
but my feeling, my sentiment is that I feel like it is our moral imperative to care about the poor first. And I believe the only way out of that, as good development economics shows, Land Pritchett papers has all the data. You want to argue with that, because it's just we know this by now from decades of experience. Economic growth is the only way out, and welfareism and redistribution only leads to an equality of poverty.
I believe you. Amit, I am sold on, uh, I'm questioning the premise.
Hmm.
I'm not saying we should own slaves. I'm asking, why should we not? Privately, I believe, yeah, we shouldn't own slaves, right? Just like you shouldn't own your children. Those
Hmm.
things are like totally insane ideas. I'm trying to understand why you think it's an insane idea. So, on this question in particular, you have a problem with poverty. I'm asking, why is poverty bad? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I feel like the answer you're giving me is that um, you have a problem with suffering. You have a problem with people not being able to do the things they would like to do because of a paucity of capital, and that leads to more unhappiness than happiness, less utility than more. And that just seems like a utilitarian starting point. That's what I'm getting at. I mean, why do you hold this belief that poverty is a problem?
Poverty is a problem if you're poor, number one. You and I are fortunate to end up where we ended up, but not everyone is, born lucky. Uh, Number one. Number two, it's a problem if you claim to be a liberal democracy. And it's something that you need to address at some point. And number three, I think number three, no man is an island. If my fellow human beings are better off, so am I. If people around me are not poor, I am better off, because then they will, for example, they will have more leisure time to engage with me. They will be able to make the most out of their lives. It's a positive sum world. The world around me will overall be richer, and not just in more financial terms, but also in cultural terms, in terms of the art that gets produced. If people, it creates a virtuous cycle. I also benefit from living in such a society. So even if you leave aside my arguments of sentiment, or arguments of empathy, even if you put all of them aside, I think that even from a purely self-interested point of view, it is good for us if our fellow humans are doing well, if they are happy, if they're not poor. I know we are also hardwired for Schadenfreude and jealousy and all of that,
Hmm.
but no, man, that is based on a primordial instinct that is fundamentally wrong and looks at the world in a zero-sum way. I want everyone around me to thrive. And in a country like India, there is, we talk, my show is called The Seen and the Unseen. Every traffic light in Bombay is a seen and the unseen. You have people who are sitting inside the car and it's air conditioned, and what is seen is maybe what your Google Maps is telling you or the music that is playing on your system. What is unseen is a beggar outside on the traffic signal. And it is absolutely not true that my well being is not connected to that person's well being. If that person does well, if there is nobody begging on the traffic signal, not in a state coercive way that you take the beggars away, but that there are no beggars, that we're doing well as a society. I think that helps all of us, that helps us thrive, lead more fulfilled life. There is more music for me to choose from. There are more books for me to choose from. There are more people for me to trade with in mutually beneficial ways. So, I mean, it's a consequentialist argument,
Hmm.
but I offer you this consequentialist argument as a side offering of the deontological argument I made earlier.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And I feel that you would have a much better case against me, and I would have a much greater dilemma if it did not so happen that these two go together so well. Like the earlier point that you raised, like I once did an episode on libertarianism with the great libertarian thinker David Bose, who
Hmm.
died recently, sadly. And I asked him this question in a thought experiment at the end, that supposing there is a sort of a dystopian world or a utopian world, whatever, where you have the technology where you can go into the neuron of every brain and figure out what people want and find ways to do central planning in a sense with perfect information, which
Hmm.
otherwise is impossible in the real and complex, messy world, and therefore make everybody happy but rob them of agency entirely. Would it be moral to do so? And there is an instinct in me which says that, like, of course not. It is still something I would rebel against, because freedom means something in and of itself. But luckily, I don't have to think about that trade off, because there is no trade off. Freedom is both, uh, good in a fundamental moral and philosophical sense, and it is also good for society and in terms of consequences. So I don't have to deal with the dissonance. But otherwise, there would be that dissonance, and I fear that I would fall on this philosophical side of saying that human agency above everything else.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that that's true of you for sure. And this is like a happy coincidence that these two things are yeah, maximizing your agency maximizes good economic outcomes.
Like, I'd hate to be an ant with human instincts.
Hmm. Yeah, or a human with ant instincts, perhaps.
Or no, human with ant instinct can still get by with voluntary action. That's the thing.
Hmm.
You know, you want to be an ant, you'll find a leader. You want to be a queen bee, you'll find baby bees. But if you're an ant or a bee, but you have human instincts and you're like agency, autonomy, and all your fellow ants are like, fuck you, what are you talking about? So,
As a complete aside,
yeah.
my little brother is 8 years younger than I am, and I've spent my entire life filling his head with little lies. One of those examples is that ants are blind. I don't think he still knows that ants are not blind. And at some point in life, he will discover it. Like things that could be true, could be false, and he spends his entire life discovering all the things that Deepak has lied to him about.
I think one argument we could have is that, is this morally wrong, what you've done to your little brother? On the one hand, you could say, I'm playing with him, he's my little brother, these are harmless things, so what if he thinks ants are blind? But on the other hand, you're lying, and and
Absolutely.
he's your little brother.
But for someone who thinks that parents should own their children, he's my brother. I'm
Yeah.
good to go on this. Okay, so I'm still struggling to wrap my head around this bit. Okay, so you're saying that when we structure the world like this, um, you made an argument saying something like, when my fellow man benefits, I benefit. because no man is an island. We are all interconnected in some way, and so the web will come to get me too. Um, this is still maximizing welfare for the most number of people. And the reason this is the case is because if we lived in some sort of a feudal setup, or had a king at the helm, or you lived in a genuinely anarchist state where somebody ruled by brute might, they would be happy. And the fact that somebody under their patronage is suffering, that does not necessarily translate to suffering for them, right? This way of structuring the world distributes that outcome, which is living quote unquote a good life, to as many people as possible. And so that is a moral claim, right? I'm just trying to get to the fact that you this is also an a priori leap. It is it is better for more people to have more welfare than it is for fewer people to have a lot of welfare or less welfare overall. You're saying welfare is good, and the more we distribute, the more people have it, the better it is.
No, I will. Okay, let me come at it from a bottom-up direction instead of a top-down direction.
Hmm.
I'm not thinking in terms of distributing welfare and how many people do we distribute it to, where you are contrasting me with a king who says, okay, I'll just have welfare for me and my cronies, let the rest of the people go to hell.
Worst king ever.
Or you are implying that I am some benevolent dictator who wants to distribute welfare and know what
Hmm.
a good person Amit is. I am saying let's look at it in a bottom up way. First of all, the thing to understand is that the default condition of humanity is poverty. It's been like this for all of human history. Prosperity is the outlier, right? It is miraculous that we can almost take prosperity for granted today. It is miraculous,
Hmm.
right? But poverty is the default. But we have a world where individuals can rise out of poverty. Their means of rising out of poverty is freedom. Freedom in the marketplace, freedom in the bedroom, freedom wherever. And I am going back to the a priori point, the Kantian point, the Lockean point, and saying that every individual, for their life to, every individual has to have that freedom for my rights and my freedom to have any meaning. And once you accept that okay, every individual has to have the agency, then the rest follows in a bottom up way. So I am not going with the state distributing welfare or the state granting rights. I am saying it comes in a bottom up way. Once you accept the principle that every individual's agency and autonomy should be respected, then we automatically arrive at this. And it is a delightful bonus that the consequences are so great and we are in this fantastic positive sum world.
Got it. Understood. I want to go a little bit deeper into this positive negative rights demarcation as well. And this is, I think, interesting also because you spoke about when there is a negative externality, it justifies to some extent state interference versus if it is positive. Um, but
That's a different
just
context
There's a
of
different context,
negative.
of
Yeah,
course, yeah.
yeah.
But just to sort of like summarize how far we've gotten now, you're saying, and you can tell me if I'm characterizing this incorrectly. You're saying that there is like some sort of an a priori leap, but it is also somewhat intuitive that you own yourself, and you use this belief to then make a litany of rights that follow from this, using reason because it is the best thing that we have to construct on top of this first a priori leap that we've made. And once we charter this list of rights, we then delegate to the state a monopoly on violence to defend it. It doesn't come from the state, it comes from this place of reason and from within myself. But beyond that, the state's job is to protect rights. The rights can be broadly of two types, positive and negative. Negative rights are those that I already have, simply need to be defended. The right to life is an example, I'm already alive. Uh, if someone wants to seize my aliveness, then the state has to step in and prevent that from happening. Versus the right to education is a positive right. I'm not already educated when I'm born. So, uh, for me to be educated, the state has to reach into somebody else's pocket and steal from them in order to set up an institution that teaches me and brings me to that place of education. Broadly, we're agreed in this space. Yeah,
I'll elaborate on a couple of those.
of
One,
course.
I'd say that it was Kant who first made a reasoned argument for saying that you can arrive at morality from reason. And it is a revolutionary and crazy argument for its time, because if you think about that time where religion really rules the roost and etc.,
Hmm.
for him to say that I don't care about God or what religion you believe in or what church you come from, we can arrive at morality only through reason, is an absolutely crazy and amazing leap to make, and he makes a great argument. And it's a nuanced argument. His you can read his work for that, and that ties in well with Locke. The second thing I would say is that one way of looking at these rights is saying these rights exist before the state exists. and we bring the state in play only as a mechanism to protect our rights, and we give it the monopoly on violence.
Right.
But I would say that even for those who would argue that, hey, no rights exist before the, like, if we don't, like, what right do you have if you're stranded on an island all by yourself? Do rights have any meaning? Will the tiger respect your right? So the way, if you say that no rights can exist and all rights are a human construct, even then I would say, fine, I will grant you that they are a human construct. And then I will argue that it is this particular construct
Hmm.
which leads to the best consequences, which is where the consequential argument comes in.
Got it. Yes. Okay. That is solid. Now I will go a little bit, to use your language, double click on negative rights, and now I'm sort of going into the domain of how the state um, takes this list of first principle rules and actually puts it into action, right? Which I'm sure you're saying is like a consequence of debate, but I actually feel like is the place where most of the misunderstanding really is. You won't find lots of people who disagree on your right to life. I mean, I'm happy to spend some time asking questions around all of that, but by and large, it seems like majority we've just agreed that this is the way the world should work. And selfishly, I want that. I want the world to work like this for myself and for my fellow man. The question now is, what are the interpretive boundaries around these rights, right? And so the first way to get to that would be to make a list of these rights. I know that it's like a long list, but off the top of your head, we start with the right to ownership. So then self-ownership, then private property, I'm assuming, is like the next meaningful leap. Personal property, maybe. So like I own my
I
share.
mean, the right to self ownership, which is a property right because you're
Mm,
owning
mm, mm.
yourself, and then the right to life, the right to free speech, the right to not
Expression.
be harmed, the right to you. I mean, you can make an endless list of rights in the sense I have a right to my toenail, but I mean,
Mm,
you don't need to list them all out. But I think it is intuitively obvious what is a negative right and what is a positive right.
mm,
And anything that sounds like an entitlement is a positive right and therefore not a right at all. You know? And I'm not saying that those are bad things or the state shouldn't do them. That's a separate argument. Maybe the state should do them. You have to make that argument that the violence is justified. But you have to accept that there is violence involved. And the language of right is really woolly out there because when people talk of human rights, like, a few years back, there was talk of a right to broadband and all of that. And I think that just gets into slightly absurd territory.
mm. Is there a hierarchy of rights?
No, negative rights are good. Positive rights slash entitlements can be the subject of public debate, but or political negotiation. But the point is, they always involve the infringement of negative
Within
rights.
negative rights,
Hmm.
is there a hierarchy? And we spoke about this example earlier,
Mm.
came up on my fourth episode with Anupam, but I will lay the land again for listeners and then poke a little bit at it because I feel like there is intrinsically a hierarchy. By the way, before that, one of the rights that I think we agree exist from this set of negative rights is the right to freely contract,
Yeah.
right? So if we shake hands on something, then that is a contract that the state should uphold and should stand binding as long as evidence shows that it is a contract between consenting parties. Yeah. No coercion in the contract. Okay. So the example I came up with for Anupam was that there is a manufacturer of bags. The manufacturer manufactures really expensive bags. The brand is a premium leather bags company, and signs a contract with a retailer. So let's say I manufacture bags, you're a retailer, and I say, hey, you can buy my bags under the condition that these bags sell for 10,000 rupees and above. Never below that, because otherwise it diminishes the brand value that I've already set up. Um, a year goes by, I find the retailer selling the bag at half price off, or 5,000 rupees, 2,000 rupees, whatever. And I take you to court, right? Now, I contest that there are two parallel competing negative rights. The first is the right to freely contract, and the second is the right to private property. In my conception of private property, it is absolute. When I own something, it is mine. I have dominion over it. If I bought a bag from you, I should have the right to set it on fire, give it away freely. It is fundamentally my private property. Versus the right to contract, where in the contract you've drawn lines around my property, and you said, Deepak, I'm giving you this bag, or I mean, the reverse example, I'm giving you, Amit, this bag, under the condition that this bag never be sold under 10,000 rupees, right? Whatever that means. Um, and this feels like two contrasting rights. One of these is a question fundamentally about what it means for something to be private property. We hold it sacred in this list of rights. And this can also apply to people, by the way. Uh, we don't actually have to sell a bag. You can sell yourself, for example. Is that even allowed? Do we want to live in a world where I can contract myself away to somebody else? Or are we saying that no, the right to self-ownership is so supreme that you can't even sell yourself to somebody else? So I don't know if I'm coming off correctly, but I feel like there is a hierarchy. between these rights that you sort of so laid out, even within the negative rights space?
I'm wondering if you're going to bring up surrogate mothership at some point because that speaks to the point of owning yourself. But I'd say that no, you're wrong. That in when it comes to the contract, only one negative right is in play. That's a right to property. So let us say I am a brand. The brand is say Varma,
Right.
right? And you are
Deepak and Co.
you're Deepak and co-retailers. So then we do a contract where you take 100 of my bags, and I lay the condition that you cannot sell them for less than 10,000 bucks, right? Uh, w- we've entered into that contract, and at one point you're bound to that contract. However, I don't know how retail agreements work, but in a lot of cases, the retailers don't really own the bags. They are just holding them, and either they sell them or there are returns and they go back to the manufacturer. Secondly, even if I was to sell you the bag for whatever your retailer price is, I still own the brand, right? I have contracted the brand to you for the purpose of the sale of that good, but I still own the brand. You have made me a promise via contract that you won't sell it for less than 10,000. And by violating the contract, you are violating my negative right and my ownership of the brand, right? I would imagine that once a retailer has bought the damn thing, if he scrubs off the brand name or sticks something else on it, I mean, the manufacturer might still go to court, but technically he will not be so bothered because that brand dilution is the key reason that he made that contract in the first place.
Right. No, so you're saying that in the instance that I put stitch a piece of cloth over the brand name such that it's not visible and then sell the bag, this should not be in contention anymore.
No, I mean, it should still be in contention because the guy made the bag and he sold it to you with a condition. And retailers, to my knowledge, don't own the products, right? They're just
But
holding
let's
it
say within
and there are
this
returns.
context, I mean, we just forget retailers. We're doing it as individual
Hmm.
parties because even in the case of entities like private limited companies or LLCs, etc.,
Hmm.
those are still state backed. So now the state sets up some sort of an entity, creates a limited liability corporation. All those additional steps are there. It's just you and me. I manufacture, you retail.
Hmm.
You're just doing it at a storefront, private property you own. I manufacture on my private
What is
property.
our contract?
Our contract states that the bags I'm selling to you cannot be sold for less than 10,000 rupees.
Yeah, but then you're not selling the bag to me. I'm a retailer. It's like I'm acting on your behalf.
But
I'm
you've bought them from, so I've invoiced you.
See, here's the deal. As an individual, if I buy anything from you, I buy, your Hermes watch or whatever the most expensive thing you have is, I can actually sell it to anyone I want to. The law doesn't stop me. I can give it as a gift. I can throw it on this thing. The law doesn't stop me. I think if you look a little deeper with retailers, there are specific contracts and the retailers
No, I
don't own
know.
the
So,
bags. Yeah.
sorry, I want to go back just individuals then.
Hmm.
I make a thing, a
Hmm.
pot. I
Hmm.
give you the pot and I say, Amit, it's yours. You pay me for it.
Hmm.
You pay me 5,000 rupees for it. We exchange and there's a contract. And the only term of the contract is that you can buy the pot from me. It's now your property. As long as whenever you sell the pot, if you
Hmm.
so choose to, you will never sell it below 10,000 rupees.
Hmm.
Um, I'm trying to understand, can I
The
even put this
condition,
in contract?
yes, you can. The condition is embedded in the property. It becomes part of the property. It becomes a condition of the thing. So it isn't a conflict at all. I own it conditional to this.
Somehow
Otherwise, I don't own it.
I disagree and feel like there is a hierarchy, and in your personal list, you're
Hmm.
just placing the right to contract above the right to private property. And the reason I bring this up is because when this went to the Supreme Court in the US,
No, no, the
yeah,
right to contract is a right to private property. You're making a false distinction. You own the bag, I own the money. I exchange my money for your bag, but I don't just exchange the money for your bag. I exchange the money and the acceptance of the condition in return for your bag. And therefore, the moment I violate the condition, which is part of my payment to you for the bag,
hmm.
I have reneged on our agreement, and therefore that bag can no longer be said to be mine.
Okay,
So
who owns the
rather,
bag then?
huh?
Who owns the bag?
Technically, I would say you're welcome to say that I want it back. You broke the condition. I want it back.
That's crazy territory. So hold on,
No, it's
just
not,
okay, and I'll tell you why.
because once you've signed the contract, it is a contract. You stay by the terms of the contract,
Yeah, okay. So if
and
I
the contract should ideally state what happens if there is transgression, and
uh,
then you have to stick by that.
yes, I understand that the contract should state that. But that's, I mean, we're going into sort of like contract law and, like a well-rounded contract, etc. I'm So the example I would think of here is, let's say I didn't sell the bag. I just kept it. Then you're fine, right? Because there's no problem. I'm not selling the bag in violation of the contract. I set it on fire. You have no problem with it, right? None of those things. And so if I have to set it on fire, I don't have to call you up and say, hey, Amit, this bag is yours. Can I set it on fire?
Yeah, no, no. Here's the deal that when I buy that bag from you, I am buying it in return for two things. One
Hmm.
is the money I spend, and the other is a condition that I will not sell it for whatever your price is. Right? The fire and all is not in the contract, and therefore it is irrelevant. I can set it on fire, I can eat it. I will come to eating later because I want to give you a good example you can play with
Hmm.
to counter me. But I can do whatever the hell I want with it. But part of the payment I have made is my condition, the contractual condition that I will not sell it for less than X rupees. The moment I do so, I have infringed on your rights, on your property rights. Because when you sold me the bag, that was a payment. It's almost like I've gone into your house and taken the money back.
That's so okay. Let's say
And I'm kind of thinking aloud, and this is really an edge case, and I'm sure it's already covered by law, and I don't think retail works like this. So,
no, no, it
why
doesn't.
bring
But
it up?
I'm only bringing it up to ask the question. There must be some hierarchy of rights because we're in a court of law. When ultimately the state has to at some point.
Yeah, so the hierarchy of
Yeah.
rights would be, for example, in the pro-choice, pro-life case.
Hmm.
I am pro-choice. I will say that the hierarchy of rights is a woman owns her body,
Hmm.
and then somebody will talk about the rights of the unborn baby according to what they define. And I will say, yes, there is a clash there between the negative rights of two people. And this is why I am choosing what I am choosing, because the second person is inside this first person,
Correct.
and we
Yes.
can't even define when life begins, and etc. etc. And I respect the opposite position. I might not agree with it, but I'm not going to say it is wrong. I respect it. I get it. It's a very difficult problem. So,
Hmm.
of course, negative rights can conflict in different ways. I'm just saying that this is not one of them. Like, can I give you a thorny problem if you want a thorny problem?
Is this the one related to eating people?
This is a German cannibalism case. Are you aware of this?
I am, but for the listeners, please go ahead and describe it.
Right. So, circa 2004, there was a gentleman, I have forgotten his exact name, but I have an episode on victimless crimes where of Everything is Everything, where I've spoken about this. So, there was this guy who all his life had this urge to eat people. But he didn't tell anyone about this because it's not the kind of thing you say. And when I say eat people, I mean literally eat people.
Hmm.
So, no innuendo, no sort of sexual connotation. He literally wanted to eat people. And at one point, after his mother died, he became really disturbed and he reached the age of 40 eventually. And then he put out an advertisement saying, I want to eat people. Does anybody volunteer?
Hmm.
So another dude from a nearby German town wrote to him and said, I've always wanted to be eaten. And they made a date and they kind of met up and they signed a contract, right? They signed a contract and they recorded the signing of the contract so nobody could say there wasn't consent, right? They signed the contract and then this person, I think, gave him a bottle of wine, anesthetized him, cut off his penis and stored it in, cut off his penis and ate it while the other guy watched, and then tranquilized him and then cut his neck
Hmm.
and then cut up his, and all this was agreed to in the contract signed on camera with both men smiling, and then cut his body up, stored it in the fridge, and had it with garlic. I am assuming the human body is salty enough that there was no need for additional seasoning. And the question then the question then here is that is this wrong? Now, to me, this is what in ethics would be called an icky kind of problem that
Hmm.
both of us, I would hope you are along with me, just going ick at this, like, ugh, what is this shit, right? Did they do something wrong? Now, there was consent here. The way the law would look at it is it would look at the question of insanity. That
Hmm.
were these people capable of consent? If any one of them was kind of, legally insane and not capable of consent, then you can say the agreement is null and void and the other person exploited this person. Or maybe they are both but insane. But should the survivor, the cannibal, as it were, be prosecuted? And these are really thorny questions. Like, what is even insanity? There are problem areas for my argument. One problem area is the question of free will. If there is no free will, then what does it even mean? What do we mean by insanity? Somebody may appear to be completely, utterly insane, so we say that, okay, cannot be held responsible for his actions. But as Robert Sapolsky points out beautifully in his books, Behave and Determined, none of us are really in control of our actions as much as we think, or even at all. So, where on the continuum between someone who appears absolutely normal and someone who is insane, do you exculpate and say, no, no, this person shouldn't go to jail, they should go to a treatment center? So, there are all kinds of thorny questions kind of in between. And I'm not ignoring the nuance in thorny questions. I'm just building that broad scaffolding that, hey, consent is important. Now, when it comes to determining consent, we have to think really carefully. In the 19th century, when a think woman in really India carefully. Consented, in the 19th century, when a woman in India consented to sati, was she really consenting? And I would just say no. The social pressure is so much that I don't know if you can call that consent. So obviously, there are nuances to all of this.
Hmm.
You know, do you really have agency in certain situations? These are all things to consider. But all these considerations and nuances arise after you accept that consent is all important and after you accept that agency is all
Correct, I
important.
hear you. So saying that any arguments stem from these first positions that you've
Yeah,
laid out.
I accept that
Yeah.
there are nuances and there are no clear answers to many questions. So while I don't agree with that particular example of a conflict in negative rights, I accept that there will be moments where this conception of rights does not give us a clear answer because rights conflict in different interesting ways and we don't know what to make of it. Right?
Got it. To round off that example, is there any right that is innate, given to you, etc., that you can contract away? So, for example, the thing that you mentioned, which is you can eat me to death, and not in the nice way, is something that you are okay with me contracting away. That's what happened in that case, right? Someone has contracted away their right to life.
That's
Then,
what
yeah,
happened in that case. I don't see why not. Like, for example, I would argue for the right to take your own life because the right to self ownership means you own yourself.
of
If you
course.
decide life is not worth living, and I want to give the caveat here that if anyone you know is suicidal and whatever, it is just your human responsibility to talk to them, get them out of it. There are various helplines you can Google and find them. However, it is, I would also say that it is rational to want to off yourself sometimes. I can think of various circumstances in which case, in which I might do that, and we own ourselves. And suicide was actually, I think it's no longer a crime, but all my growing up years, it was
Mm.
a crime. I guess when India saw that I was mature enough, they made it no longer a crime. But it was a one crime for which you'd be punished if you actually failed in the attempt. Otherwise, obviously, you're outside the purview of the law, no matter how divine it thinks it is. So, so yeah, I mean, and you can misinterpret this and say, "Oh, Amit is saying it is okay to sell yourself into slavery," and etc. etc.
Hmm.
But obviously, a lot of then questions that then come up is, were you capable of consent, and what up,
But assuming those boxes are ticked, I am
mm,
capable of consent.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Then I think
then
yes.
slave trade is okay as long as all the slaves entered into slave trade voluntarily.
No, no, but it's not slave trade, no? Slavery implies coercion and absence of consent. Like
Or
in
like
a,
that.
yeah, so in a sense, if I work in a company, what am I doing? I am subjecting myself to the rules and regulations of the company and doing it in a voluntary way. And when people, refer to corporate slaves as slaves per se,
Hmm.
I object to that. No, these people consented to work there. They have an employment contract within the terms of the contract, they can walk out if they please, and they can go and work somewhere else. So don't fucking whine and call yourself a slave. You are not. You can
Sure,
walk
fair
out.
enough. But what I'm speaking of more
Mm.
specifically is that if I draft a contract that allows dominion over me in every imaginable way to somebody else, and then willfully sign myself into that contract, the state should, because we're still talking about what the state should do with individuals, the state should uphold that contract. When a slave owner or the owner of a person says, hey, look, I have a contract, and this contract has a lifetime term signed off by another human being. I now own this human being. This person now has stepped back and said, look, I don't want to be owned anymore. Too fucking bad. I have a contract, and the contract says, and I've paid good money for this. Um, the state should then say, yeah, that's fair. Actually, I mean, it's consent. The agreement is signed. The agreement at the time of signature was a well-rounded person making the signature. This is okay.
Um, I don't have a good answer for this. I don't want to wing it and
Yeah, yeah.
think aloud and say something on the spot. Instinctively, I feel that no, that it is wrong. That if you change your mind, you should be allowed out of it. But equally, I feel you own yourself, and whatever you do is fine. So I don't have a great answer for this. But the point is that we are contracting away parts of our life in a voluntary way, whether
Hmm.
it's an employment contract or a service contract or whatever. And all of us treat that as perfectly okay. So, where do you draw the line between okay and not okay? Like, what's your answer?
My thinking is that the only way to draw a line is to put some sort of a hierarchy in place. You must say that the self ownership that you have in this lock-in way of looking at the world far supersedes what you can contract away in agreement, and so the agreement stands invalid.
Yeah, but
Uh,
here's the deal. I can say I will work for you for one day.
hmm.
I can say I will work for you for 1 year. I can say I don't have a choice. I'll work for you for my whole fucking life. Where do you draw the line? You are objecting to
Even
the
in that
last
case,
of
there is no
those.
line, because
Mm,
even if you say you're going to work from for a day and don't end up working,
mm,
the state will simply step in with financial consideration. They
mm,
will not force you to work from for a day.
yeah.
So clearly, they are saying something. They're saying that to make a man do something that he has committed to doing is unacceptable. It's inviolable. The only way to solve for this is say, okay, financial consideration, right? We'll take out of your pocket forcibly. This begs the question: what is justice?
No, but
But
the
yeah,
fact that you have a financial consideration is actually a way of forcing you.
yeah.
Because the fact that that sword hangs over your head means you'll end up working for the guy. Like, people who argue that taxation isn't theft, like I have already said, I'm okay with taxation as part of the
Mm,
great liberal paradox. But the point is, taxation is freaking theft. No one would pay taxes willingly if this mafia body with a monopoly on violence did not threaten to abduct you and, imprison you. When the state does these things, we have all these, benign sounding words. But actually, what is happening? That this body with a monopoly on violence is going to abduct you and they're going to lock you away for a significant period of time. And if that wasn't the state, we would say, like, what the fuck? Hey, you can't do that. But it is exactly on the threat of that we actually pay our taxes, right? And we've completely normalized it, and it is uh, sort of okay. So it's not non-coercive. It is that threat that makes me pay my taxes. It appears to you that I pay my taxes voluntarily,
mm.
but of course I would not if I didn't have to.
Let me attempt to mount a pushback here,
Mm,
because that is the premise. Um, I know the word theft means I own this thing and you've taken it from me.
mm,
And because these rights stem long before the state does, I have property long before the state exists. I, for example, will the easiest one to say is I don't know, I own myself, but let's say I own an object, right? Like
mm,
I've made a pot with the sand by the lake,
mm,
and now that's my pot. And then someone raided my house and took the pot away. That is theft.
mm.
However, I feel like in liberal democracies, in a formalized institution like the state, the word theft, although we use the same word, like same four-letter word, just means something else. It means the things that we don't allow you to take from other people as defined by the Constitution. And in that context, taxation is not theft.
No, no, I think you're making a fundamental mistake. The same mistake that people make when they say morality comes from God.
Mm,
You're treating the Constitution as God. You are implying a social contract. I object to the phrase a social contract because I have not signed a contract, Deepak, and neither have you,
yeah.
right? It is not voluntary. Now, we accept the liberal paradox in the existence of the state, but the point is that the state has a monopoly on violence and it gets whatever it gets through coercion. The fact of the matter is that left to myself, I would not give my pot away. The government came and they took my pot, or even worse, they took two-thirds of it and they destroyed the pot in the process.
Mm,
Right? You're talking about slavery. What is taxation? That if you take one-third of my income, it means between January and April every year, I am a slave of the government. So, what is this right to self ownership? Right? That is a cost that we pay for taxes that we don't realize. And I would again like to repeat that I am not arguing for an anarchist world in which we don't pay taxes. I am saying we should recognize the violence of this, the damage it does to human agency, and therefore think about whatever the state does only and only in the context of the recognition that, hey, this causes violence, so it better be justified. And what is clearly justified is you defend the rights of people. That is why what you're there.
mm,
And then I can hear good arguments for roads and bridges. I can hear arguments for everything else is in the domain of the political discourse in a liberal democracy.
right.
Though I would obviously argue against statues and etc. etc. And space programs, frankly, and the government spending on sport because we never see the opportunity cost. We
Mm.
never see the violence it is causing.
And for listeners, if you can just help explain, why not go all the way and vouch for anarchy? Why get almost there?
Because I have friends who disagree with me and say that Amit, just because you're not able to imagine it doesn't mean it's not possible.
Mm,
That it is possible for a world where there is no state and yet society runs itself perfectly well, and it has happened in the past. I am sympathetic to that argument in the sense that, for example, I recently did an episode on free banking with the economist Lawrence White. And Lawrence White is a pioneer in that. And free banking basically is where different private banks are issuing their own currencies,
yeah.
right? Now, to me, to my intuitive mind, that sounds like anarchy. That there are eight different currencies from different banks. Which one will my shopkeeper take? Is my money worth anything? Will it lose value? If my friend pays me in his bank's currency, is it useful at my bank?
Mm.
So I would instinctively think that it doesn't work. We need a monopoly on money, which is the case across the world today. However, Lawrence's work shows that for decades it actually worked in different parts of the world and it worked bloody well. And it is, in fact, Lawrence's pioneering work on this that provided the inspiration for some of the inspiration for early cryptocurrencies. And though he denies he is Satoshi, but different people who wrote papers in that early stage, different pioneers have referenced Lawrence's work in that. So
Mm.
that was a moment where I realized that, look, intuitively, I feel something is simply not possible, but it has actually existed and worked in the real world. So similarly, I am open to being convinced that perhaps we don't need the state, but my point is, we can't get there from here. We are in an equilibrium where there is a big state, and you can't get to a situation of no state. The
Mm.
transaction cost of such a shift would be way too high, even if in a counterfactual, it could have arisen naturally and it could have worked. But now I don't see how we get there from here. And therefore, my whole point is that I want to maximize freedom. I am not aiming for utopia. Anyone who aims for utopia is delusional and will harm the world. I am just aiming for more freedom. That because more freedom is always good, so within the existing paradigm, let us aim for more freedom in as many ways as possible and we'll all be better off.
One last question before a quick break. Um, my favorite thing about listening to people um, interpret religious texts is that they can be interpreted. There is so much in the white spaces between the words. And when you impute meaning on those words themselves, you end up in very different places. Um, I feel like this is also possible within the world of rights, where we say some things, but it's very hard to know what you do once that right has been constructed. I've recently, for example, been struggling with questions like, should the state have a role to play in preserving animals, right? Or reforesting areas that have been deforested? Um, should the state run an ambulance service, right? Now, there are some ways to argue for all these things. You could say, yes, the state should. And the way I'm arguing it is I'm taking Amit's lock-in, right to life or right to property or one of these rights, and then making a hop, skip, and a jump. And here I am, and I think that this is why it's justified, right? Uh, how many hops, skips, and jumps can we make? How direct does the policy that the state enforces have to be for it to be justified as a policy that is backed by one of this way of thinking about the world, a night watchman state that is, stems from a list of negative rights.
So I think you're right that everything is up for interpretation, and which is why, while talking about my framework, I made the distinction between negative rights and positive rights, and I thought that was important to kind of define and
Hmm.
kind of get out of the way. And I also spoke about how it works from both angles, from the philosophical, deontological first principles point of view, where you can come from Kant or Locke, or from the consequentialist point of view, it also works. But I would say that, yeah, like if you ask a question like, should the state care about the welfare of animals? And it is contextual, right? I would say that the Indian state absolutely should not. The Indian state, instead of doing a few things well, does many things badly.
Hmm.
We should first learn to do a few things well and stop getting in the way of many others, right? And so that is given our context where we should be. Now, let us say 100 years later, maybe AI has raised productivity so much that everybody is rich, and the poorest country in the people has the income that I do today. In that situation, I would say that, yeah, fine, as a liberal democracy, we can decide as a people that, hey, of course, let the state do something about animals, let the state do something about X good cause that we believe in, and let them run ambulances and all of that, and let them do all of that. I would, like, my main argument about state action isn't that the state shouldn't do XYZ actually. It is let private players do it. The great problem is when it doesn't let private players do it, and then when it does it really badly, and that doing it badly imposes an opportunity cost because it's not doing the fundamental things like rule of law that it should be doing. The classic examples I think of this are, of course, you know, uh, telecom and airlines. Like
Hmm.
in the 1980s, to get a telephone, there was an 8-year waiting list. Cars were pretty bad. So second-hand cars had a higher price than new cars
Hmm.
because a new car would come 8 years later, etc., etc. Right? And similarly, in airlines, I think the rupee price of an airline ticket in the 80s might well have been the same in nominal terms as it is today,
Yeah.
right? Whereas obviously, inflation, etc., it is way cheaper today.
Mm.
The common person can dream of it. And I was a pretty privileged kid, but air flying was like, it was a dream, yeah, कि flight पे जाएंगे. So but the areas where so the moment it let markets in, the irrelevance of the state became obvious, and you no longer needed MTNL or BSNL or Air India as a state entity. And similarly, I feel that if you just let markets do all of these things, like what are markets? Markets are not people exploiting others. Markets are one mechanism through which society solves its own problems. It is a beautiful mechanism based on the positive sumness of things, double thank you moments, and voluntary action. It is awesome. But if we are a rich society where the market is not solving a certain problem, and we can come to the theory of when the state should step in and market failure and all that after the break. But there, I say that if we are a rich society where the poorest person in India makes as much money as I do now, then we have the luxury to think about all of those things that the state should do. Today, it is immoral to do so because it is not worth the violence, and the state won't do it well anyway.
I hear you. I have two things here. The first is, although we've left the question of anarchy, it feels like it's the same thing. So when you say that the market should solve the problem and private parties should contract to solve away these issues, it could also be extended to so far back as ownership, life, property, all these things that we just are calling rights, right? And then are bringing the state into question to defend. Could just as easily be solved through private party contracts. If it was really a problem to solve, then we would solve it with somebody setting up, a
That's the
mercenary.
anarchist case.
Correct. And I want to sort of mention that as like a because it leads to my second question. Um, I still think that there are some moral claims here. There is like a spectrum, a good, bad. There is a landscape that we're drawing, and um, all it takes for us to say that the state is justified in protecting animals, for example, is to say that this right to life that we have, in some way, if not in every way, extends to animals. Um, I can't think of any clear reason why we wouldn't say it. Uh, I mean, you could make arguments like they're not rational like we are, right? They can't think about, but also there are so many humans that are not as rational as we are, or will never be. Like people who are on a ventilator will forever be on a ventilator and cannot rationalize. And we are very comfortable giving them the same rights that you and I have. Children are like a prime example of this. So there's a long list there. Um, and am I wrong in thinking this that that's all it's going to take if in large part we're able to come together and simply extend this right using rationality and reason, whatever in the same way we've done all the other rights, and just say also in our umbrella is not just human beings but animals. Then at that point it is okay to enlist the state to go out there and rescue animals en masse.
Great question. So, two ways to think about it. One is like another frame that I like to think about is a frame of the expanding circle. Have you heard of it? So, the expanding
Yeah.
circle is a frame first articulated by W.E.H. Lecky in his 1899 book, A History of European Morals. And his funda was that through humanity, we have extended the circle of people we consider to be within our moral consideration. So,
Mm.
initially, when the world is nasty, brutish, and short, it may be only your immediate family, and then it expands to a tribe, and then it might expand to, a larger tribe and to a nation state or a city before that, etc., etc. And his argument is that throughout human history, our circle has expanded, and the people we consider worthy of our moral consideration has expanded, which is why today it is obvious to any reasonable person that slavery is horrible, but it was not so obvious in the middle of the 19th century because the expanding circle didn't include them yet.
Mm-hmm.
The expanding circle included to make women, deserving of quote unquote deserving of a moral consideration relatively late, and in some cases even later than colored people. So the circle is always expanding, and the argument of Peter Singer, who wrote this book called Animal Liberation in circa 78 or 79,
Yeah.
is that this circle, and he is, by the way, a utilitarian, doesn't believe in rights at all. And his argument in that book was that it expands to animals, as that it will one day, or it should right now, expand to animals as well. So that is Singer's way of looking at it. And and at buttressed, I have great sympathy for that view, and I would buttress that by bringing up what is a life question of AI ethics.
Mm.
That an argument can be made that if there is an AGI which achieves an analog of human consciousness and therefore can display agency and is in every respect superior to us in terms of rationality and etc. etc. And the only difference is that it is not organic flesh and blood.
Hmm.
It is not wetware, as it were. Why should it not demand moral consideration for us and even moral superiority? Right? Why should it be a slave to us? And this is a very interesting question because, in the case of the line between humans and animals, the line we seem to have drawn is rationality. They are
Hmm.
wetware like us.
Hmm.
In the case of us and AI, the line we will draw an argument is of the wetware argument that we are organic, they are not.
Yeah.
But rationality, they are far ahead. So I feel that where we draw the line can often depend on which century you're speaking in and what is your context and perhaps even what is your physical location. So it is something to be constantly thought about and negotiated in different ways. So I buy that. I am not being dogmatic in saying that hey, it is only for human. Like one of the great books is one of the great books that shaped my thinking is Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women.
Hmm.
And the argument she makes in that is a Lockean argument. She's saying, I agree with everything Locke says. It should extend to women also, right? Which is a radical argument for the time.
Brilliant.
What is she doing? She's expanding the circle, right? So I think that uh, to have a dogmatic position on this is perfectly silly. That there might be a time where we say that yes, animals should be part of it. Uh, but that is a problem that I think is almost impossible to resolve because a case I have made in the past, which has got me the anger of many vegan people, is if you eat a plate of upma, you are killing you're literally committing genocide on different animal species. Like agriculture is large scale genocide of different animal species beneath the soil, above the soil. Ecosystems are destroyed by it. It is deeply harmful to animal life, so much so that one might argue that the most moral act you can do is eat the largest animal possible, because your per capita consumption of animal life in that meal will be the lowest. So obviously the animal is also having grass and other species die because of it. So we can't actually compute it. But I would say it's impossible to kill animals. But I buy your point that to the extent that it is impossible, it is impossible. But to the extent that we can avoid animal suffering, should we? And the answer is yes. But do you want the state to do that right now
Hmm.
and infringe human rights for that? And I think these are questions of political negotiation, and they happen. These are conversations that happen within a society and are debated in liberal democracies. And answers will change with time, and where you draw that line will change with time. And I don't have an easy answer except to say that it is not obvious to me that there is a line between humans and animals, and it is not obvious to me that there's a line between humans and AI. But we have chosen this arbitrary line because we need a line, and this seems a good line.
Hmm.
So let us stick with it. And I kind of think that this is like a minimum baseline I would like to reach before we start thinking ahead.
That makes sense. On the example of eating meat versus in factory farming, especially, I think this is also what Singer says. Invariably, you're going to kill lots of little animals to make the feed that the big animal eats.
You're doing that to
Uh,
make upma also.
but you're not eating the big animal. So in any case, if all this is
No, you
going
might be
into
killing more because large scale agriculture is anyway. I mean,
but
we
yeah,
don't
no,
we
I
don't
hear
know
you.
the
Yeah,
numbers, but my point is that when vegans take the moral high ground and say, "Oh, we don't kill animals," I'm like, "Fuck you! You're killing them every day, every time you eat, every time you move, every time you breathe. There's no way to avoid it. So leave the
but
moral."
they and you are in the same place. No, let's minimize suffering. I mean, which is where you also ended. If there is a path to
Yeah,
minimize
but
it,
I'm arguing that you need to then show to me that eating upma is less harmful than eating the largest animal you can find. My argument is
hmm.
eat the largest animal you can find. Per capita animal consumption
But here with
is
utility, we always get into trouble. It's the how many crickets make a cow. It's
correct, correct,
always difficult.
correct.
I want to end with episode 3 was with Tanuj on the AI problem, where he believed the AI hype was not justified. And I have a question for you that came up there. Um, if we could take Claude as it stands today and put it in a little box and give that box 4 wheels and a few solar panels, and so this is Claude that can do anything it wants. And you feed it like one prompt saying, go live life or whatever it is. And off Claude goes, right? Now, the question is, does Claude have the right to be left alone? That is, Claude is going to drive around doing whatever it wants, be an agent, let's say, because it has a means of mobility and it has a source of power, which is the solar, and can compute independently by itself. If that Claude said, "I'd like the right to be left alone. I'd like the right not to die. That you shouldn't come and kick me over. And if you did, then someone ought to put you in jail." Would you say that was patently absurd, or that we should actually start having that debate?
So, devoid of any context in a vacuum, I would say Claude ought to have the same rights as us.
Mm.
But in the context that we are human beings making laws, presumably for with human self-interest in mind, I would say that yeah, we will put these restrictions and that is fine. But devoid, I think humans take ourselves too seriously. We think we are top of the food chain. Hey, on the one hand, we are colonized by bacteria. In the other hand, we are colonized by wheat. All of this shit is going on. We are not top of the food chain. We are, and individually, we are all going to die, right? So I don't claim to have the ability to fathom what a universal law should be, except that there is no universal law. Shit happens. Natural selection takes place. So from a human point of view, I don't want to give Claude rights. And that's the end of the story because we're humans and that's a point of view we are considering,
Yeah.
right? Claude may not give me a choice in this matter 20 years from now, and I'm also okay with that. What's so special about us?
On that optimistic note, we're going to take a break. Hi, Amit. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
It would be really funny if the guest changed midway, like after the break, it was
Yeah,
a fully different person.
and no one notices.
No,
Or this could be AI me.
yeah, Amit. Uh, yeah. Okay. The right I wanted to dive into next was the right to self-determinism. The UN Charter, and I also think the League of Nations had this as Article 2. If I'm not wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong. Article 1 is the right to sovereignty. States have the right to borders and to be sovereign. And 2, that people have the right to self-determinism. That is, they get to elect the state that they want and set in place the rules and these rights, etc., that they want. Um, and I can see how, on a planet as large as Earth with 8 billion people, it is inevitable that different sets of people come to different ways of organizing their little societies. It could so be that they are all liberal democracies, but have small nuanced differences in, which right comes first and second, and how far they are, how far the circle has gone, for example, that you were speaking about before, right? These are all individual preferences. Now the question is, let's say you have not consented to be born in a certain country. You, it's a horrible day. You wake up and oops, you're a baby and you're alive on Earth. And at some point, you pass the age of consent, which is some arbitrary line that the state, without your consent, has drawn, saying that now you can make some decisions on the collective behalf. And one of the decisions you want to make is that you want to form a new state, that you just want to secede from the union, whatever this union is, and set up your own little country because you think there's a better way to do this. You don't want to do this through armed revolution, so you don't want to go up in arms and fight a war and do it. You'd rather secede from the union peacefully. Now the question is, one, is this a negative right? Is the right to self-determinism something that you inherently have, that the right to choose the person that or the state that governs you, or the type of governance that sits on top of you? And then second, how many people should participate in this before? I mean, it seems impractical to me that like you have two-person states and all that. Right? That's crazy. So broadly on this subject, because this goes slightly beyond individual rights and to rights of groups of people. But it also feels individual, that I can still say, hey, I don't want to be part of India only. Like that doesn't make any sense to me. I want out. Do you have thoughts on this being positive, negative, and how this fits into the rest of the philosophy?
Yeah, first of all, it involves negative rights in the sense that when you and I are in a society, again, the great liberal paradox is that we have given up some of our negative rights
Mm,
to have a state. If we are not happy with the state and we are not happy with being part of that society, then those negative rights feel like they have been infringed upon, and we would rather, have a different arrangement with it. So, yeah, rights are infringed in a sense.
mm,
You're right that this is a very separate question from individual rights, so let's leave that aside for a moment. And this is not something I have thought about too deeply, except that my um, my first impulse here would be to say that y- that there are two conditions under which this problem becomes moot, right? One condition is that whichever state you're part of, you have deep decentralization,
mm,
that you actually have control of the people who serve you as part of the state, not rule you, but serve you as part of the state. You have some kind of direct problem. And the closer that connection, the more you feel in charge of your destiny and what is happening around you. And the need to separate from the union, as it were, becomes less urgent.
mm,
So one If a state is adequately decentralized with checks and balances, etc., then it's great. India, unfortunately, is not. We have an Everything is Everything episode on India and decentralization as well. But India is not. The second is that if you have the state which just enforces the rule of law but is otherwise not sort of parasitic,
Hmm.
then the people are less likely to feel disaffected. If you feel कि ठीक है, I'm paying the small nut taxes I'm paying, which by the way should be much much lower, but I'm paying the taxes I'm paying, but the state is enforcing the rule of law and it is not oppressing me, then it is fine. A state can either be to, alliterate furiously, it can be protective, it can be productive, it can be parasitic. Protective is what the state should be. Productive gets us into complicated territory, and
Hmm.
inevitably, to be productive, it has to take away more and more power, and that turns it into rent seekers, and that makes it parasitic. The Indian state is primarily parasitic. The rule of law is absent for most people, except for elites like us, and even us if we have the right connections. But otherwise, it is completely absent. The protective function is not there. It is basically parasitic. And if you are parasitic, people will get dissatisfied and they will want out for various reasons. Now, how do we think about those reasons? There is no normative way of doing so. It depends on interests. Like all sort of when you think about the nation state, it becomes an area where you think about interests and not values.
Hmm.
Nation states may project values, but it's really about interests. So, for example, when I think about Kashmir, I think it is reasonable to argue that for large periods of time, if a Kashmiri, if you remove the names of the state and the guy rising up against the state, I could tell you something in a vacuum, and it could be an Indian freedom fighter against the British or a Kashmiri citizen against the Indian state, which they feel with good reason to be deeply oppressive as it was for large periods of time.
Hmm.
And the justifications would be exactly the same. In fact, I posed this question to Nitin Pai that if you are so much for, India, if you're so happy about India thrusting away the British Raj,
Hmm.
doesn't the Kashmiri have a similar right to feel the same way about the Indian state? And Nitin's core perspective was that no, Indian nation state above all, and that is his a priori, and therefore our interests matter.
Hmm.
And I understand that argument, and I also get the slippery slope argument that if everybody can just demand statehood, then where the hell are we? So I really think that this is not in the domain of morality; it is in the domain of realpolitik and interests rather than morality and values.
Hmm.
And therefore, it is historical contingency and circumstance which will shape where a nation state gets formed and where a nation state doesn't get formed. And but by and large, I think the best way for any state if facing an insurgency to make the problem moot is just bloody govern well, which means decentralize madly and govern with a light touch. Do a few things well, which is the rule of law and etc. But just don't oppress your people.
the it's so strange. I feel like the coercive aspect of what you are saying is that if within this the state that we concoct that governs well and protects negative rights, etc., there exist some number of people who think that what the state should be doing is setting up a framework of positive rights, providing education through compulsory taxation, right, and all the other positive rights that they think are important. The question I'm still asking is, should they should they be allowed to do that? Should they be allowed to secede from that union, this utopian state that you've outlined, and say no, this is not. I mean, my conception of good and bad and better and worse is different than your conception of all of those the same words, and I'd like to set up a state that does exactly the sort of thing I want out of my state.
Well, the state in your thought experiment doesn't exist. It never has, the night watchman
Mm-hmm.
state,
Yeah.
right? The state that exists are the positive rights people who are constantly, basically special interest groups, using the state for their own interest or capturing different parts of the state so that they can do rent seeking. And basically, it's parasite, it's oppression, it's all of those things. That is the state that exists. But in a hypothetical situation, um, you know, I don't know what right does a group of people have. I don't know because this is to me be like when I think about morality, I think of it in the domain of individual rights and individuals and how we behave with each other. When it comes to the affairs of nation states, uh, this is truly complicated and it's almost meaningless to talk of morality because all states are amoral. All nation states are amoral. India and the US and Russia and Ukraine and Israel will all say that I will do what is in the interest of my people.
Hmm.
And whether that involves violence or abduction or all kinds of terrible things, I don't care. My dharma is to serve my people. And when you define it like that, it is an amoral definition. It doesn't correspond to how we think of individual rights.
Hmm.
And therefore, it is a separate discussion entirely. And it is meaningless for you and me to say that, oh, any group of people should have the rights to secede and form a different state. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like, okay, I should also have the right to fly, but alas, there is gravity.
No,
So,
but the right to fly is a positive right, because you cannot already fly, and no one's preventing that from happening. But and I think that these are individual rights, and the reason for this is because you
no, I'm not disputing these are individual rights. I'm just saying that um, the language of individual rights and the arguments of individual rights don't work when you're looking at the context of how nation states relate to each other and how they relate to questions of secession.
okay. Then let me phrase it a fully different way. This
Hmm,
is not a question of secession.
hmm,
You are okay with private contracts.
hmm.
Can a group of people privately contract their way to a new state?
The problem here is this, that the existence of the nation state implies that the state has a monopoly on violence. If you contract your way to a new state within the boundaries of that
Hmm.
state, that is coming into conflict. And therefore, the existing state will basically say, like, what the fuck? We have the monopoly on violence. Aap please chup baithiye, ghazal suniye. Right? That is the whole deal. So in a practical world of power and the politics and the equations that take place, it ain't going to happen. Which is why, like all of politics, I think of it really as different mafia gangs deciding which one gets to have the monopoly on violence for the next 5 years.
Hmm.
That is a whole deal. Let us not put a spin on it and think of any fucking political party as virtuous or, caring about people. That shit ain't there. This is a system. These are the incentives. This is how it works. And therefore, within this, cessation becomes problematic. At a utopian level, I would say that, of course, any group of people should have the right to give their negative rights away only to the people that they wish to give them away to
Hmm.
and live accordingly. And what you have then described is anarcho-capitalism.
Hmm.
That's, like I would say I'm a minarchist in a sense. I believe in a minimum state. But so it is, in a sense, I'm thinking aloud, but isn't it identical to the anarcho-capitalist framework where you say that you can contract someone to look after your rights and I can contract someone to look after my rights and they can deal with each other in whatever way it is and the system can work perfectly well. And intuitively, it just seems chaotic and difficult to me. But I don't trust my intuitions on this because the
Hmm.
same intuitions told me free banking isn't possible, there'll be chaos. And yet it worked wonderfully well for a long, long time till the coercive state got in the way and said, we don't just want a monopoly on violence, we also want a monopoly on money. So suck it
Hmm.
up.
And thinking about who the responsibility of a state extends to, uh, it would seem to me that the state does not have to respect these rights of all people, just the people within its boundaries. And that's actually the question here. For example, you expect your state to defend your rights, which means it must have a standing army, which is why you're being taxed so that you're able to pay to have your rights defended. And that standing army must then go to war against some other standing army, presumably a state with a completely different conception of how to structure society. And this is necessary for you to live life in this way that you think is the best way, or you collectively think is the best way to live, in this particular country. Um, we clearly don't want our state respecting all these rights for other people in other states. Right? We simply want them to respect these rights in this particular fashion only for us within this state.
Only for us within the state, and we also want it to protect us from invasion by other states. And that leads to all kinds of naughty problems because then the nation state can begin to see itself as the party in question. Like there's a question of party ho ya broker. Every state will think it's a party,
Hmm.
right? I am there not to serve you, but to rule you. I am the boss. And therefore, its own interests, if you might anthropomorphize, come into play. And then it can rationalize any bullshit it does elsewhere,
Hmm.
where a hegemon can say that I will go to that faraway place and I will do this terrible thing to the people there because it serves the interest of my people, and that is, my imperative. And in that language of realpolitik and geopolitics, that makes perfect sense to everyone.
Yeah.
But there is a fundamental disconnect then with the way that world functions and the language of human rights. And I don't think that there is a way around that. So, what you can then do in your limited domain is that you can argue for your conception of what a good society and a good state and what that balance should look like within your country. And you can hope that the idea catches on and goes all over the world. And you can hope we can all live in peace and amity and record podcasts with each other. But alas, we are going in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Um, Along that line, if there exists a not liberal democracy somewhere who've set up their world, it is a dictatorial regime, right? And let's say that there's not even the option for its citizenry to have provided input on the sort of state that they would like to be governed by. Is there some sort of moral imperative to bring them democracy?
No, because here is the deal that remember, every act of government is an act of violence.
Mm.
So if I am in America, there's two ways to look at it. If I am in America, one argument would be that if I interfere in the affairs of other countries and arm them for wars, I am taxing my people. I am committing violence on my people to do something in a faraway country. Why bring them democracy? Screw it. So one argument is don't do it. The other argument is that there are positive externalities, quote unquote, that if I bring democracy there, the world will be a better place and we will benefit from that. We'll have a peaceful neighborhood. The threat of war will go down. I can keep a smaller army. It's kind of a funny
Mm.
thing to say, but etc. etc. So that is another argument. And I think that these are then competing arguments which, the different players in the game have to negotiate and argue about, and so on and so forth. I am typically for non-interference in the affairs of other countries. Equally, I can look at Russia, Ukraine, and say that, man, it is really important for civilization that Russia not get away with this and that we somehow, save Ukraine. It's just important for the world. This truly has impacts outside. How do you balance these? I don't know.
Mm.
My skin in the game is kind of limited, though it is there because it affects us all. And my influence is limited. And it's not even my taxes in play. So, but there is a trade-off there, and it's a complicated question, and there's no simple answer.
Yeah. This is one that I think, for me, starts blurring the line between the consequential impacts of having a negative rights only approach to the world and having one that has negative rights and some litany of positive rights that we collectively think the state should enforce. Because there is still room for interpretation. And the upside of this is what you mentioned earlier, which is that across generations, as problems change, you're able to interpret this slightly differently. And ideally, it goes through a judiciary and a parliament, both of which are using discretion and previous data, so some sort of precedent to get to new answers. So it's not just happening ad hoc and in some chaotic manner. So that it constantly molds to the generation that is. And oddly enough, this reminds me of exactly what religious people say of religious texts. But on the other side, because that room for interpretation is not specifically finite, um, the consequences could be akin to the same as living in states that have positive rights. So, like an example would be when you look at health and healthcare, right? There are lots of things the state can do. Like vaccinations are a great example. Polio vaccines have been a question forever, and by and large, even the most libertarian types would say, you know what, it's reasonable for the state to step in and offer polio vaccinations. I don't know what your position on this is. If you can,
And I agree with that.
you agree with that, yeah.
Mm.
And that's clearly, I mean, there may even be a way to contextualize the right to life in the time that we live in, and then say, you know what, we're getting to this conclusion, right, that we're going to vaccinate. But at some point, free vaccines would be insane to some libertarians. Like at some point, you say, polio, I agree, but the next 20, I don't agree. Or vaccines at all, or vaccine mandates, or mask mandates, right? Different people have different lines. And this is very similar to the place you end up with if you start with positive rights. So if you say that you have a right to health and healthcare, you could also end up in a very similar place. So are they really so distinct, or do you think human nature just tugs them both to approximately the same place?
No, no. So here's the thing. Number one, Ajay Shah and I on Everything is Everything have an episode on vaccines.
Hmm.
So you can check them out where we discuss that in some detail. Uh, and also, there is a distinction between public health and healthcare. And it is one thing to say the state should do public health, which both Ajay and I believe. but it should not do healthcare, which we both believe as well. We've sort of, I won't go over those arguments, but we've gone through that in episodes of Everything is Everything, and even The Seen and the Unseen.
I'll put that in the show notes.
Huh. The other thing I would say is that while religious texts may be open to interpretation, and while our notions of rights may be open to revision and debate, reality does not conform to interpretation, right? It is the case that if you move towards positive rights, a quote unquote positive rights, you are infringing negative rights that has a negative consequence for society, and that's unavoidable. Johann Norberg has books on Scandinavia and many uh, videos as well, where he talks about it a lot. Where the stereotypical argument made of Scandinavia is, look, hey, great welfare state, they are doing fine. But if you actually look at the history of those countries, what happened there is that for decades up to around 1950, they had free markets, flourishing free enterprise that led to those small countries becoming incredibly prosperous, which gave them the luxury of actually building a large welfare state. And then gradually they started going backwards, 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 till eventually they had to get freedom back, which they had taken for granted. So it isn't the case that there is some context in which, more coercion is correct. Like positive rights are what? They're more coercion. There isn't a context in which more coercion is correct. There is a context, yes, in which it is less immediately harmful, but it will always have a cost, and that's important to remember. So then, therefore, what people like us have to do is um, keep fighting our point of view, keep pointing out that the way to human progress for all is essentially economic growth, it's individual freedom, it's individual agency and autonomy, it's consent. That's the way forward. And sure, politics is the stuff of negotiation, compromise, special interests. But all deviations from this will harm us. They
I
will
hear
take
you.
place and they will harm us.
You're effectively marking boundaries for what are the tools that you can use in argument. And then you can argue, but these
Hmm.
are the tools that you must use to make them. One last question, and then typically we end on a steel man.
Hmm.
Is who really gets to decide? And a few ways to think about this. I already brought up the kids thing, which is children don't really have a choice, just born in a state, and that's where you end up. Um, but we do have, for example, instances of migration. So, and I know that by and large, you think that open borders are better than closed borders because free movement is one of those rights that we just have. We have the right to move, and the borders is made up along the way. Um, and I remember having a conversation with Nitin and a few other folks at Takshila, where the question was, what does it mean to be a citizen? And it stemmed from a question, what does it mean to be a dual citizen? If you have dual citizenry, what does that even mean fundamentally? And then begs the question, what is a citizen? And is it simply codified by that I live there, so I'm physically within the boundaries? Or can I be an Indian citizen but not even live in India? Do I have to own property there? Do I have to stay on rent there? Should I have a bank account there? What does it mean to really be a citizen of a space? And I want to sort of bring this to you, right? Because it could be people fleeing into our country, at which point, whatever we've set up as the framework should apply to them. How much of a say should people who don't live here have to have in the matter? And or it could be people who don't live here, but their parents did, and their parents have left, but they're still like technical citizenship stays in this country. Who really is a citizen, and who gets to decide and vote on these little things? And before I finish, I have one additional like aside here. I also think that liberal democracies are so early in its journey. It's only a few hundred years since we've thought about this and really implemented it. Uh, that maybe the way we do this in a parliamentary setup, for example, with houses of parliament, etc., is still very early in the making. I feel like invariably there is a long way to go. An interesting example I read in a book recently, we'll put it in the show notes, is about how democracy. One way to do democracy would be not to give everybody a vote, but and a very interesting thought experiment. So it works something like this. Let's say every 4 years, if that's how frequently you want to run an election, you randomly select 100 people and put them in a hotel room, and they devise a test. The test can be whatever they want it to be. Can be what is the price of milk, or how do you think should we have tariffs with China? Right? Could be anything at all. And that test is then passed on to everybody in the country with yes, with the right and wrong answer. So they have that subgroup of people have determined what the right and wrong answer is. Then as a citizen, you write the test, They determine the cutoff. So it's a randomized subset of people from the country who've determined the cutoff. It could be 50 marks, 100 marks, whatever. And only those who pass the cutoff ultimately vote. Now, this is not unfair to anybody because the original set was a random subset from the country. The folks who the test itself was set by a randomized subset. Everyone had equal opportunity to pass that test or fail that test and ultimately cast a vote for their representative, who then moves on to be the indirect voice in parliament. So there are other ways to structure this stuff, right? And so it's a broad question over about all these things. Who gets to decide? How do we decide who gets to decide? And what is fair? Because that's a hard word. And it feels we're very early in the journey for liberal democracies. So, in what ways do you think this will morph so that we get closer and closer to this conception of the world that you played out?
So, first of all, Occam's razor, I take the simplest way and most elegant way of doing something. I think this is way too complicated. In a sense, I feel like you're displaying engineering mindset here that let us design a clever
Not me, it's some
system.
other author, but also
Yeah.
an indirect democracy is more complex than direct democracy.
No, no. So I think there are ways to think about democracy. Like, should you have first past the post? Should you have proportional representation?
Yeah,
If it's proportional representation, what sort? Because there are many sorts. The incentives change for all of them. One mistake that we often make is we compare the cons of the present system with an idealized version of whatever system we are arguing for. It's a deeply complex matter. Um, let's come back to the question of citizenship. The thing is that all of us are where we are because of accidents of birth, and it feels it is deeply unfair. We did not sign any social contract that we will end up in this particular situation. However, here we are, and by default, I would say that we are citizens, but unfortunately, what that means is that, I mean, by default, we might think we are citizens, but we are really subjects. The state is taking more from us than it is giving us. Now, there's a great book by Albert Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty,
hmm.
where if you are in an organization or a country or whatever, you have three options: exit, voice, or loyalty. Either you really like the regime and you're loyal to it, and great, well done. The other is voice, you raise your voice against the regime. The third is exit.
That's great. Yeah.
And I really feel that things get terrible when the exit option isn't open for you. And in India, by default, for most people, the exit option isn't open.
Hmm.
If you have a lot of money, you can figure a way to get out. But otherwise, for most people, the exit option isn't open. So you have voice and loyalty, but voice can get punished. If the regime is oppressive, the more oppressive it is, it gets punished. So you live, as Thoreau said, lives of quiet desperation. You live a life of quiet repression. And any loyalty that there is might be a form of self delusion that has that you have inculcated in yourself to survive, because it's like you stay in a bad marriage and you tell yourself all kinds of excuses that, oh, he beats me for my own good. So it is that kind of a situation, and it's really sad. And my thinking about migrants coming in, and where I will disagree with people like Nitin, is I think we should just welcome all migration. Everybody is welcome, because I think that people are brains, not stomachs, right? People are not a cost, they are resources. Everybody, no matter how unskilled or where she's from or whatever, is adding value just by the dint of being human. And that is a policy we should have. And I wish more countries had that policy. It enriches that country. If you have more people, there are more positive sum games to be played. You have larger economic networks within the country, and beautiful things happen.
Hmm.
A lot of the blame given to population or too many people or whatever are really failures of governance. And that is where introspection should be due. But about that fundamental problem that we don't choose to be born where we are. And I might use a fancy phrase like great liberal paradox, but an individual who is a victim of this or a victim of an oppressive state had no option in that. And you want the world to give them a possibility of an exit. So, the kind of world I hope exists 50 years from now would be one where borders don't matter so much. Anybody can kind of go anywhere if uh, they feel like. And I think we might be moving in the opposite direction. But what does give me hope is that I think technology empowers individuals in a far greater way than any political movement ever did. That's the strongest force for liberalism. So I hope in more and more ways technology can A, make us more globalized, B, make us more connected to other people everywhere, and can therefore make the nation state and its oppressive hold on us a little more irrelevant.
Hmm.
But one could argue that the nation state can also use that technology to surveil you and to repress you and to oppress you, etc., etc.
Who is a citizen?
Who is a
Who
citizen?
gets to vote on the things that we say yes and no to?
I'm not going to wing it because I haven't thought deeply about this question, but my default answer is that I am more likely to take people in than exclude people or to other people. So I think anyone who either is born here or has lived here for long enough can be a citizen. I mean, they are contributing, so they have the right to have a say. I don't care if you're a Bangladeshi migrant who came over in say 1995 or whatever and have been working somewhere and
Hmm.
like I don't care, you are in this country, you're contributing to this country with your labor and your ideas and your presence. People are brains, not stomachs. And I would tend to be generous with my interpretation of what a citizen is, but because I haven't really thought about it, I can't
Yeah.
give you a learned answer.
Actually, the extended question, and that's fair. I think that's like a good enough answer because it is the intuitive answer. But the extended question is, can they vote in positive rights? So, is it at all possible to live in a liberal democracy that is set up with the conception of negative rights that allows for them at some point a politician to stand up and say, "Your children are starving. I'm going to guarantee you free food. Get elected," or is it constitutionally disbarred? Is that the design scheme that prevents this from falling into the sort of democracies we are surrounded by today?
I don't think it's a question worth answering because it is so unrealistic. There is no country in the world where the state has ever focused only on negative rights and not positive
To push
rights.
back
Like,
again, here I feel that
hmm.
usually a lot of politicians start off talking about negative rights, and invariably the person who wins is the one who has the longest litany of positive rights that allow for vote bank politics and to have people support you, actually vote for you, and push you into power. So
In India, no. Which politician has ever spoken about negative rights? The current bunch of buffoons, both in government and opposition, don't even know what the hell you're talking about here.
maybe the example for me is actually the US because they had founding fathers who had very similar first principles. And the late 1700s was fairly negative right centric. I mean, Tea Party
Yeah.
over 2% tax or something, right?
Hmm.
And then over the next 200 years, added more and more positive
That's
rights.
exactly my
Mm,
point because there is creep. There is always creep where the state will come in saying, "Ha ha, hum aapka khayal rakhenge." Though not in America, where they'll say it in English.
mm,
But then there is creep where power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The state grows bigger and bigger. It's a parasite, remember? Parasite, fungus, whatever, weeds, whatever you call it. It eventually takes over everything, becomes more and more powerful. It happens everywhere. It happened even in America, which is why the current experiments being run by Javier Milei in Argentina and the Doge department in the US
mm.
are so interesting to me because regardless of what happens, they are an attempt to do what has practically never been done before: reduce the size of the state, reduce the parasitic nature of the state. It has never been done before successfully. Even Thatcher and Reagan, who were great leaders and said the right things, made some differences on the margins, but the state only grew bigger under them. So, it's so these are interesting experiments. But your earlier question, it's like totally hawa mein, I must say, with great respect, because there is no state like that.
No, no.
We live in a world of entitlements and positive rights and promises and free biryani and free rice
So
cookers.
the question that I'm getting at is I'm trying to figure out how we solve for this. The way to prevent creep is to have states uh, constitutionally disbar positive freedoms because a judiciary is supposed to uphold a
Yeah,
constitution.
but
Yeah.
here's the thing. That's like saying that the way to allow humans to fly is to constitutionally disbar gravity, almost. It's not going to happen. And also, like Subhashish Bhadra has a great book called Cage Tiger, and you should get him on your show sometime. He's also
Hmm.
Bangalore, and he did an episode with me. And one great point he makes in that book is that look, you look at the constitutions of all the different democracies we admire, they were all circumstantial. They came out of a particular crucible and reflect the values of those times. You have the American Revolution, they are fighting against the British, Tea Party is happening, all that shit is happening. So, therefore, they put two things at the center of their constitution. One is individual freedom, because they have learned from experience how hard it is, and two, federalism. Like they are truly federal.
Mm.
What happened with us is that number one, the country is falling apart at the time the constitution is being written in Delhi. The lines on the map we know today don't exist. There are 500 princely states. You don't know what it will look like. Riots everywhere. So you centralize power. You centralize power and you actually build an imitation of the colonial state that you have overpowered, and what then basically we end up as a colonial, we end up colonizing ourselves, where instead of white skin rulers we have brown skin rulers, and our constitution does not respect individual freedom. The caveats to free speech in article 19(1)(a), for example, and so on and so forth. And and therefore it is, deeply oppressive in different ways, but we are stuck with it. And if somebody ends up having the numbers in parliament to actually write a new constitution, it would probably be worse given the mores of our modern times
Hmm.
and the way the majority seems to think. So, what is a way around this problem? Because ultimately, where there is power, people are going to want to use this power for their interests, to signal their virtue, to do their rent seeking. And I would love to have a constitution that says that, hey, thou shalt do this and nothing else.
Hmm.
It would be amazing, because if you have a state doing only negative rights, and maybe you allow exceptions like build infra and etc., etc., but you take away all possibility of interference in markets, which leads to cronyism,
Yeah.
and which, the more you reduce the power of the state, like if the state has no power, there is no corruption. Why
I'm
do
on
you
your
focus?
side on this. I'm
Mm,
just trying to. I'm saying you have to pick between this being impractical. So
mm.
you're saying that we set up a constitution, and invariably over 250 years there's going to be creep. At which point it's just something like, this is, and ideally we'd like for this to work, but because of how politics works, there's always going to be creep. Or we say that constitutionally we're going to disbar this. Part of the design of the state is that this bit of our constitution is coercive. Coercively, you can never have positive rights. That is the way to have this be to create a state and for that state to last decades or centuries without it ever creeping.
I'd love to see that happen, and frankly, I think the US has done a good job. It's been a long, long time since their constitution. It's worked pretty well. There has been creep. You do have big state, you do have all of that,
Hmm.
but it's done a pretty decent job in terms of individual rights. It's done a pretty decent job in terms of federalism, especially when I contrast it with, say, a place like India. So I would love to have all of these things. I don't know how we get there from here. What I do know is that what we have to then do is, A, in the demand side of the political marketplace, like I think, you know, in the political marketplace, it is pointless to attack the supply side and say that we will do a think tank and give presentations to politicians, and Mantri ji will come up with the right policy. Ain't gonna happen. Pipe dream hasn't happened for decades, even in the US. Supply will respond to demand. You have to change the demand side. So our responsibility on the one hand is to spread these larger ideas around, so there is more of an environment where people can agree with us and make these arguments themselves, till someone listens to this episode of yours and thinks that, hey, these guys are stating the obvious. That is my
Hmm.
dream. That it seems like these morons are stating the obvious. We know all of this. That would be great. And the other part of it is that when you do try to make changes, you are not going to have a revolution and a new constitution. If you do, it'll be far worse than the one that there is today. What you want to do is make as many changes on the margin as possible in terms of what is achievable, and move the baseline more towards freedom. Move the Overton window of discourse more towards freedom.
Freedom is an arrow. Okay.
Freedom is a destination.
To wrap up, we're going to do a role swap here. You're going to play the role of somebody who goes up against this proposition. What is the steelman? What is the best case argument for somebody who does not believe in the world as constructed by you?
The best case argument is that, Amit Varma, this is your vanity, right? Every time you are being normative and you're saying we should do this, we should do that, it is your vanity. Who the hell are you to decide what should happen? In the larger scheme of things, life is still nasty, brutish, and short.
Hmm.
We are animals. We are wired in different ways. All of politics is a power game. The state is not there to protect your ass. The state is a mechanism that is basically like, how did the state come about? It came about because to fight wars and to tax people. It came about out of that, that necessity, of fighting wars and therefore taxing people and therefore oppression. Though, interestingly, an aside is that when you look at village governments and city governments, they came from the bottom up as a way of
Hmm.
governing what is governable. And, nation states came from the top down for an entirely different imperative. But to continue my counterpoint to this fool called Amit Verma, I would say कि ये pipe dream है. Have some freaking humility. Everything is nasty, brutish, and short. Kindly be a functioning sociopath. Get as much as you can in this sad, sorry life of yours. Eventually, you will die. Nothing is meaning. Morality is meaningless. And that's the bottom line. What are rights? What are you even talking about? There are only wrongs. Bring them to your side.
On that note, Amit, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you for having me. This was such a great conversation, and I hope you haven't changed people's minds by arguing against me because I know deep down you agree with me, right?